I guess today is about moving forward, isn't it? It's about inclusivity. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, what can the police tell the caring profession about LGBT equality? I'm going to talk about the journey that we've been on as a police service, the journey that we are still on, and hopefully how we're going to move forward into the future. And I'm going to pepper in some personal experiences and views as well, just because I think people like to hear personal views. They resonate better rather than just hearing corporate spiel. And who wants to hear about the current shape of policing? It's quite a boring topic. Most police forces have, does it say what I do up there? Yeah. Most police forces have staff associations of some shape or form. Lots of the public sector does. Lots of the corporate sector do as well. We've got 8 that currently exist within West Midlands Police, covering a whole range of different protected characteristics. All of them will have a different story about how they began. I'm going to share with you our story of where we began as a staff association. I'm currently the chair, and that's a position that I'll be in until September this year when I step aside and somebody else takes over, because we have 4-year chair terms. We set up originally 18 years ago, and it was off the back of 2 of our female officers, 2 female police officers who had their relationship blessed. Wasn't a marriage, wasn't civil partnership, because those things didn't exist back then for gay people. But they had a blessing. And when they got back to work after being off leave for their honeymoon or whatever it was they went on, somebody leaked it to the press. Somebody went to the press and talked about this blessing. Now, bizarrely, the press had a field day, and it was all over the front pages of the tabloids for a couple of days. Not because they were lesbian, but because they were police officers. They were gay police officers, and that was unheard of, apparently. One of them, who was a PC at the time, would go to people's houses to take statements and do the kinds of stuff that we do, or used to do when we had resources. And when she'd leave, a member of the press would go and knock on the door and say, do you know that was a lesbian you've just had in your house? And people were outraged. People were quite shocked. A member of our police authorities don't exist anymore, but a member of the police authority at the time went on record as saying there are no gay people in West Midlands Police. The public want to be policed by people like them, i.e. straight. Now, that was somebody who was a councillor at the time, give an idiot a platform. The police authority tried to distance themselves from those comments. They weren't the views of West Midlands Police. They were the views of one person. But it still went in the press. It still made news. But there was an awful lot of support for those officers from other rank and file officers that were gay or lesbian, bisexual to some extent. There's not many openly bi people in the police. And organically, a staff association was born. We'd already got the Black and Asian Police Association. We'd already got Women in Policing. So what it was called Rainbow Network at the time was kind of just an organic growth of, and that sounds terrible, of support for those 2 officers. And that's where we started 18 years ago. Now, I've lost my place. We've moved now from being that internalised staff group that only works with police officers and police staff to being much more open and with an external remit. So we'll do a lot more work with members of the public now. One of our key drivers is to close that gap that Peter's just talked about, where hate crime is happening up here, but reporting is down here, and we're trying to close that gap and understand what the barriers are, why people don't report. Right, now, I bet the vast majority of you here today are here because you want to be. So to an extent, a lot of what we're saying is preaching to the converted. But we'll all know colleagues, regardless of their identities, who, when you try to engage them in this subject, will roll their eyes, or they'll say, I don't see what all the fuss is about. or even worse, they'll say, I don't agree with what you're saying. There's probably some in here too, and they're probably shuffling now, now I've said it. I find that really disconcerting when I hear it from LGBT people, and I hear it a lot from my own colleagues in the service. I've never had a problem myself, so I'm not going to be an activist brigade, I guess. I've encountered that from people in the service, people in the health service. I've come across diversity managers who haven't been able to see past their own noses when it's come to LGBT equality. Nobody in this room, I will say, in the police service. And a gay colleague recently said to me, a gay female colleague recently said to me, I really don't understand why you do all this stuff. She was talking about me medal. And she says, I really don't understand why you do all this stuff, because we work in an organisation that's so open and everyone can just be themselves. But that's her experience. And that's brilliant. That is brilliant. I'm glad that that is her experience. And it will be the experience of a lot of people. But it's not the experience of everybody. And there's still loads and loads of work to be done. Just because in some people's eyes we've achieved that equality in legislation, which we haven't quite yet, but I'll come on to that in a little bit. But in some people's eyes we have achieved it. It doesn't mean that the work has stopped. Told you I was going to keep referring to my notes. I'm not reading them word for word though, which is quite good. So when I was asked to come and speak today, and I've just realised I dance around a lot when I'm talking. I should just stay still. When I was asked to come today, I reflected on what I was being asked to talk about, and I really thought, yeah, we are in a good place as a police service. There's still loads to do. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge our past. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of policing and the LGBT community, what led us to where we are now, and why this agenda is so important today. I could paint a really rosy picture of where West Midlands Police is, that the senior command team would be much more comfortable with me talking about, but it wouldn't be honest and it wouldn't be very open. And when we're a service that is constantly talking about needing to be more transparent and needing to be open and accountable, we can't hide the fact that there is a checkered past. The police service has been at odds, to put it mildly, with the LGBT community ever since the service was founded by Robert Peel. Not just because it was doing its duty in enforcing the law, but in a lot of cases, the service has actively sought out and persecuted gay and bisexual men with the same kind of enthusiasm you would expect the police to go after serious, dangerous criminals. LGBT people were kicked out of the military up until 2000 when the law changed. And it might surprise you to know that it was illegal for gay men to have a threesome or even share a hotel room up until 2000. We have actively prosecuted people for age of consent offences up until the late 90s. And a lot of gay men will have criminal records because we've prosecuted them under age of consent offences. And that was why it was so important that the age of consent was made equal. One of the reasons it was so important. We have also, and when I say we, I'm talking collectively, I've never done this, but I'm going to say that, aren't I? We've also purposefully gone out and trapped people and caused people to commit what was a criminal offence in order to get an easy arrest, an easy detection. We'd say, accept a caution, it's your first time offence, if you go to court, you'll be outed that you're gay or that you've been caught in a toilet. We would go out and cause people to commit offences. Entrapment doesn't exist in British law, so it was perfectly legal for it to happen, but completely immoral, completely wrong. And I'm probably talking about 20 years ago, but that's not all that long ago in reality. And then we wonder why LGBT people don't trust the police. I'm bashing myself a little bit at the moment. We'll come on to some love in a bit. It took me a long time to pluck up the courage to join this service, and I was 27 when I finally did it. I'd wanted to do it for a long time. I thought it was going to be closed doors for me. And my kind of impression of the police, my view from an outsider looking in, was very much shaped around how the media were treating Brian Paddick. Years ago now, Brian was a commander in the Metropolitan Police. He'd got very liberal views that were really ahead of his time. But he was gay. So every time he was in the press for whatever decisions he'd made, his sexuality would be used almost as a slur, like it was a bad thing. Gay commander, Brian Paddick. So when I was looking at that and thinking, do I really want to be part of this service where if I come out, my sexuality is going to be used against me all the time? That's what took me such a long time to join. Had I joined when I was 18, I'd be getting close to retirement now, which would be great. But I didn't. By the time I did join, legislation had moved on a lot. It was 2006 when I finally joined. But my perception was still that I was going to have to be, I was going to have to man up, I was going to have to be straight, acting, which is really difficult for me. You can all laugh, by the way. But that isn't unique to policing, and I now know that isn't unique to policing. I've spoken to a lot of gay men in lots of professions, including in healthcare, especially doctors and surgeons, who to this day still feel that they have to hide their sexual orientation in order to progress, in order to have the career that they want to have. Firefighters, teachers, etc. It's not unique to policing. I think it's probably fairly unique to males more so than females. I might get shot down for saying that, but that's my experience of it in policing. I thought I was going to have to keep my head down, pretend to be something I'm not, make up a fictitious girlfriend just so I could fit in. I felt that if people knew I was gay, then I would not only have to prove myself as a cop in the first 2 years, because that's what everybody has to do, but I'd also have to prove myself as an equal to my male straight counterparts. And that still lives with me now. I always feel on a back foot. I've got to prove myself equal to you before, and equal as a cop before you'll accept me. A lot of that is probably in my own head. But very often, our experiences as LGBT people, growing up, especially those of us that went to school through the Thatcher years, under Section 28, and those people before then, our experiences will heavily influence what we think of ourselves. We'll often make ourselves a butt of jokes. I know I do. We'll use self-deprecating language when talking about ourselves before anyone else gets a chance to. And we'll work on the assumption that we're perhaps not as valid as our heterosexual counterparts. Now, I'm generalising, not everybody is going to go through that, but it's certainly something that I and lots of gay people I know have gone through. So we'll have to work twice as hard to get anywhere, because we've got to prove ourselves first. Hopefully that makes sense. That might resonate with some of you. So perhaps some of that perception I'd got about policing was based on that upbringing. Some of it is going to be based on the media and the stereotypes put out there in documentaries, dramas, whatever, that gay men are all camp, drug taking and promiscuous, because that is the stereotype, isn't it, that's out there. I guess I've gone off on one. The points I'm trying to make, I have only got half an hour, haven't I? This morning I thought I got 15 minutes, so I'm just going to keep rambling then. The points I'm trying to make is that whilst it's a great benchmark and sends out a really positive message, featuring on the Stonewall Workplace Index, sorry Pete, and having amazing policies in place is meaningless if your workplace culture doesn't reflect it. It doesn't reflect those achievements. You've got to understand that everyone has different life experiences, everyone is an individual, everyone is unique, and we all have different lived experiences, and it's those lived experiences on the ground that really matter, not the fact that we can tick a box and say we've got this policy and that policy and every other policy in the world. Now, the Stonewall Index doesn't do that. It's a lot more than that. I'm just being a bit, I'm just simplifying it. Now, let me be clear, I'm not saying that we need to have workplaces where everybody is out. I'm not saying that all LGBT people should be out. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that we should nurture and have those workplaces where the decision, whether to come out or not, isn't dictated by the workplace that you're in. Does that make sense? It's about, if you don't want to come out, then it's your personal choice not to. It's not because you work somewhere where you're thinking, if I come out, I'm going to be treated differently. Now, I burst out of the closet at 16. I'd known for a few years before that. It was all very dramatic, as these things sometimes are. I'd known all through school I was different. Obviously, Section 28 was in play, so I couldn't really talk about it, although I didn't understand what Section 28 was. But if I'd gone for any help with teachers, I wouldn't have been able to access it. I know now that Section 28 really, and if those of you don't know what Section 28 is, Google it. It was in play and it really stunted my personal development. I can say that because I've got the benefit of hindsight. It contributed to that internalised homophobia that I experienced at the time. Obviously, teachers weren't allowed to talk about it. Nobody was allowed to say it was perfectly normal, these feelings I was having, and nothing to be ashamed of. And so, therefore, you do start to feel shame. I left school at 16 because I couldn't take the bullying and the name-calling anymore. They all knew I was gay before I did. And it was a really negative environment to be in, so I couldn't face remaining at school. And it took me until I reached my 30s. I know I don't look old enough, but it took me until I reached my 30s to start to feel more comfortable in my own skin. And to this day, I kind of struggle with self-esteem issues, which I firmly put down to those formative years at school. So, thank goodness, our young people these days in schools don't have that oppressive regime that they're living under. In no small part, thanks to our next guest speaker, Peter Tatchell, and many other activists like him. And I'm not suggesting young people have an easy time of it, but it's certainly less oppressive these days. So anyway, back to getting into the job and finally joining the job. Once I hit the training school, I came out really quickly because it was that kind of environment. It was a really nice, welcoming environment. And there was 18 other people on my class. All of them were straight, they reckon. But they were all genuinely lovely people, and I could just be myself with them. All of us were on the same journey. We were all trying to prove ourselves and learn how to be a police officer. But as any LGBT person will tell you, and I'm probably teaching some of you to suck eggs here, you don't come out once and that's it. Every time you change teams, every time you meet somebody new, you're faced with that dilemma. Do I tell them? Because we live in a heteronormative world, do I tell them I'm gay? Is it going to make them feel awkward? Is it going to make me feel awkward? What's it going to be like? Especially in the police, where we've got a tendency to move people around an awful lot. We are constantly moving people around. Part of that is because of development. Part of it is because we are constantly restructuring. I don't need to talk to you guys about cuts, do I? But with every change of team and every new set of colleagues comes that anxiety and that horrible feeling that I've got to start all over again. My experience so far has been very positive, and I've been around WMP now for a long time, and I'm known as they've told me I'm the force lead for sexual orientation, so if that's not outing me, I don't know what it is. I am so far out of the closet now, I wouldn't be able to find my way back if I wanted to. And I don't really generally have problems, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel a duty and a passion to keep moving forward with this work. Some of that work is about pushing for changing legislation. Now, I mentioned earlier that legislation is still unequal in some respects. So, for example, I can arrest, I can record, I can charge somebody with a racially aggravated assault. I can't do that if it's a homophobically aggravated assault, or even if it's a disability aggravated assault. I can charge and arrest and record an assault, but when it comes to that aggravating factor, we're relying on a judge to say, yeah, okay, I agree with that, and I'll increase the sentence, and it doesn't happen very often. Sentencing for offences against people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity or their disability is very, very unequal to the current legislation for race and religion. And I think that reinforces that hierarchy of protected characteristics that is certainly very, very evident in policing. I don't know about the health service, but it's very evident in policing. It kind of sends out a message that racism is very serious. It is, I'm not saying it's not, but it's saying that homophobia isn't as serious as racism. And I think that is probably one of the reasons why reporting rates are much lower amongst LGBT people. Now, it's not for the police to change the law, but I see the fact that I hold a really unique position in society as a platform to be able to speak up for people who don't have that voice. Being a police officer gives me a voice that people will listen to and take seriously, whether we like that or not. And I see it as my absolute duty to influence and push forward the agenda for equality and inclusion for LGBT people. So, in terms of where we are now as a service, hopefully you're not all falling asleep yet. I've lost track of time, actually. 5 minutes. Oh, I've got 5 minutes. I knew I'd... Two! I've got two! Oh, I better hurry up then. In terms of us as a police service, we've got all the policies under the sun. We've got a transition in at work policy, which was groundbreaking in policing 6 years ago when it was first written. It's probably a bit crap now because it's not really moved on with the times, but we were there at one point. We have a very large and visible allies programme, which is so important. People. I did promise I wouldn't mess with my microphone, but people seeing these lanyards when they go into a new team or department, I don't think you can underestimate the impact that has on inclusion in the workplace. Externally, we've got an LGBT reference group, so that's fairly newly formed. That's about engaging with our communities and getting their views and being a critical friend, telling us where we're not getting it right, telling us how we can shape our services and make our services more accessible to LGBT people. And every new police officer that joins the force goes through an LGBT awareness input, which is delivered by people with lived experience to really underpin what the unique challenges are for LGBT people. Because if you've not got the lived experience, you may empathise with it, but you might not necessarily understand where the issues are coming from. I just want to finish on the 50 years since decriminalisation, because Channel 4 made loads of programmes last year about the celebration of 50 years since decriminalisation. And this is one of the things I talk about when I'm training student police officers. I say it's partial decriminalisation. It wasn't in 1967 that suddenly the floodgates were opened and everybody was equal. It was very much partial decriminalisation. And when I mentioned to you earlier about hotel rooms and all that, I won't say anything again. It's only really been, I would argue, 7, 8 years since LGBT people have had similar equal protections in law to their heterosexual counterparts with the introduction of the Equality Act. So the 50 years since decriminalisation, I think, was a bit of a myth, because we were still prosecuting people up until the late 90s for age of consent offences and so on and so forth. But looking to the future, it's looking very bright. As long as there's no sudden changes in the law, because as we know, as we see in Russia and as we've seen in the United States, laws can be changed, laws can be repealed, equal protections can be removed. Just because we do have some really good legislation in place now doesn't mean it can't be taken away from us. So we can't rest on our laurels. I think I'm going to end there. I was going to talk about our Gender Identity Task Force. In fact, I will, very, very briefly. I promise I'll only be 30 seconds more. We have a Gender Identity Task Force that I established in force a couple of months ago, and it's staffed by some really passionate allies, and they are really keen for us to get to where we need to be in terms of trans. Now, today I'll extend an invitation to the Trust. Anybody who is interested in this Trust who wants to be part of that group, so we can share some ideas, share good practice, and hopefully make the lived experiences of trans people who live, work or access our services better. You're more than welcome to take part in that group. I can't stay for lunch because I work for some horrible people who won't let me. But Sally Edwards at the back there is our diversity manager. So if you want to speak to her about getting involved in that, or if you want to get involved in that IAG, then please do grab Sally. And I'm going to finish now. Thank you.